Hi. So we're going to start. Welcome Catherine Clinton. I'm going to give a very short introduction because I want to leave you with Catherine to hear what she has to say and chat with her. But in case you don't know me, many of you have met me before. I'm Dr. Laura Sandy. I'm in the history department with some of my colleagues here. I'm not going to name everybody. You'll meet them along the way of your MA studies, and you may have met them before. But I'm the co-director for the Centre for the Study of International Slavery. We have our MA in International Slavery rebooted, a very exciting start run by Dr. Viney this year. So we're really, really excited to have everybody here. Just by coincidence, Catherine was coming to the UK, and we were having a chat, and I said, oh, do you want to come over? Not because I don't like doing work, because I love to welcome you too, but Catherine has had a much longer career than I am, a very successful career, and she's seen a lot of things happen, particularly to do with American slavery, but in slavery studies in general, that she's going to talk to you about. A lot of change over time. But last time I saw Catherine, well, not the very last time, she was actually here for Black History Month before COVID, the last one that was in person, and she gave this talk, Dismantling the Mammy Enslaved Women in Modern Slavery Studies. We had various people funding us to put on events, and I hope we've got some interesting stuff that you've seen for the Centre for Black History Month. And Mary, who's just over there, Dr. Mary Booth, can tell you all about our interesting events later if you'd like to hear. So we've moved forward a bit in time. I'm sure we can reflect a bit on the impact of COVID and things like studying history, digitisation, and all sorts of social and economic and political travesties that have come out of this, as well as other things that link directly and indirectly to some of the stuff that we'll be talking about as MA students and in our MA in Slavery Studies. So just a quick introduction to Catherine, because I want Catherine to come up and chat. And of course there'll be time for questions, but we have decided to make this quite informal so that Catherine will talk for 20 or 30 minutes. If you want to immediately ask her questions that go out of your head, then please do. But otherwise we're then going to just eat and have a refreshment, and Catherine will happily talk to any of you about either the subject matter or studying at postgrad level. Of course, Catherine's had lots of postgrad students and runs a very successful MA program in Texas. So Professor Catherine Clinton, welcome, the Damon Chair of American History at the University of Texas, San Antonio. I don't really know what to say for someone who's written over 30 books. It's a career aspiration. I think I'll never get there. So essentially, one of the books was something that inspired me to study slavery when I was an undergraduate and write my thesis on women and slavery in the American South as a third-year student and go on to do an MA in studies of slavery. So I can thank you for your inspiration and the work of you and your colleagues that you'll talk about. Catherine's written non-fiction books, she's written children's fiction books, she's written for the New York Times, she's written poetry, and she's written for the National Park Service and does plenty with heritage. So at the moment she is advising at the Alamo to think about how to retell that story in Texas. She's also had a job in Ireland at Queen's, and she is, I don't know, did you say you're on the board or advising for the Troubles and the Peace Museum there? So again, if you're really interested in your MA, whether it be the slavery studies or the other MAs on offer with heritage, Catherine has a kind of wide knowledge and influence. So these are just some of the books that I picked out over time. So we had The Plantation Mistress that kicked off your career. Well, you had a career before that, but the very famous book, and then of course Harriet Tubman, written in 2004, well before the film. Again, Catherine has advised on films from her work, so Mrs. Lincoln with Steven Spielberg. So, again, I'm sure you'd be happy to talk about what it takes to turn history into a film and how you advise people like Steven Spielberg when they're making films and try and make it as accurate as possible. Catherine has had a very prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship recently in US history, and she was president of the Southern Historical Association. And just to talk to the fact that last time we saw you and we were talking about slavery and women, a more activist approach to history, being a lecturer, being a student and a postgrad. Catherine, and I missed this, it was in Florida, so I missed going to the beach also, which was very sad. But as president of the Southern Historical Association, Catherine used her position when she gave her keynote to talk about what she called, and you can read this brilliant speech that was turned into a publication, The Southern Social Network. And this was about sexual harassment in academia sexual harassment of postgrads in particular. So bravely, instead of talking about herself and her work, she talked about what she had understood and witnessed and what had happened to her over the years. And she turned this into a non-profit educational initiative, which do look it up, the Cassandra Project, to look at sexual harassment in academia. So if that isn't exhausting enough to be Catherine Clinton, she's done something else beyond that, and there's Catherine in Alabama talking about the Cassandra Project, is that she has been the answer to a Jeopardy clue on the TV game show Jeopardy. So I'm going to hand over to Catherine Clinton. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us.
Well, it's very nostalgic for me to be back here in Liverpool. Thanks for the warm welcome, and thanks for being at the Center for International Slavery. I took it upon myself, since I was going to be over here, to tell Laura I would love to come back to Liverpool, because I remembered the students, especially the last time I was here, and several writing to me and asking me about prospects in the United States. Along came COVID, and that really sort of dampened all of our enthusiasm for travel. But I assure you that I continued here and will continue to come back, because one of the things is, if you are eyewitness to dramatic changes in historical fields, it can be quite exciting. So I'm going to take you a bit through and then fast forward to where we are today. But at any point along the way, I would love to be interrupted, because usually I like to come and say, well, you've all read my work now, questions and answers. But that's very presumptuous. We're all very busy. We have lots on our minds going on. And although I think slavery and its legacy is so with us in the United States, in every election, in every political issue that comes up, and we are now engaged in statue wars, and I'm engaged in international aspects of that, looking at a project on Australia, the UK, and the US, and how the statue wars have evolved. So I'm very interested in that particular project. The other thing I have to say, since I see Steven here, is I've been influenced by my friends in the field of the history of medicine to become very involved in looking at attitudes towards sickness and health, insanity and sanity. And my next project is looking at Union soldiers in the Civil War. I told my mentor, James McPherson, that after 30 years I was ready to acknowledge there were white men in the Civil War. And it's time that we start looking at some of their issues and looking at the Civil War through gender in another aspect. And so my next project is looking at diagnosing insanity and the treatment of PTSD in the 19th century, and how it was extremely gendered, extremely racialized. And a lot of my very good colleagues have been working on this so that I can kind of slip in under the radar, take advantage of their work, and look at this very question. I can encourage any of you who have a free weekend coming up and transportation to go to Leicester, where the British American 19th century historians will be meeting this weekend, and my good friend Deirdre Cooper Owens, who wrote the book Medical Bondage, will be there speaking. So Deirdre is just one of another generation of people who are looking at issues of women and enslavement in a way that I think really is exciting for me. When I began my undergraduate career, I was majoring in African American Studies at Harvard in the 1970s, and looking at the issue of race in the plantation South was a kind of exciting times, because slavery was being massively reinterpreted, a huge reconsideration of slavery issues. There was a field called cliometrics, the study of what I think today we would call data, certainly data humanities. We would look at the way in which today it's so important that we are being taught and told, and we have a required course for our master's students looking at the issue of the data humanities. So I do think that that was an important thing to go forward, that I was taught, instead of saying many, some, most, few, you might have to actually statistically analyze your material. But historiography is always a pendulum, and so the great masses went away, because I would tell my students, for example, that if they were all looking for good grades in my course and they wanted to ingratiate themselves with me, that was a wonderful thing. But if they didn't do their work, and I decided, took it upon myself to physically beat one of them, perhaps in front of the other students, that might have a very dramatic influence. Well, it's just one. That's not statistically significant, is it? So we have to look at the psychology, again, of slavery. So again, it's swung a different way. And I have been through many seasons and many cycles of slave historiography. But the one I think that I'm proudest of is the revolution looking at questions of gender and sexuality. Because I can say when I was an undergraduate, it really was such that looking at the issue of gender was subsided, it was subsumed, because actually putting African Americans into the history of slavery was something new. I mean, that seems rather absurd as we look back, but remember someone like Kenneth Stamp in the 1950s could say, what is a slave, using that term rather than slave person, what is a slave? But a white man with black skin, using this kind of analogy, and of course using male analogy. So a group of women came along and said, this is so wrong, because to talk about the emasculation of the slave as a historiographical problem was leaving out half of the enslaved population. And also, what I was taught to believe by another mentor, Orlando Patterson, was really a loss, because we have in world history internationally the robbing of people of their labor. We have serfs, we have indentures, we have all of this. But slavery was unique because it was robbing people of their kin. Therefore, the reproductive aspects of slavery was what was central, was what was essential, and that essentialism was something that a pioneering group of women scholars were willing to put on the line and argue. And I can say that I first began to think about this internationally when Bernadette Bruton, who is a scholar of religion at Brandeis University in 2008, called for an international conference to look at this question of the morality of slavery and religious aspects of slavery. And she had people come in. Later, a volume was published called Beyond Slavery, Overcoming Religious and Sexual Legacies. All right, so this was a way, and this book came out in 2010. And I could recommend it as a broader look, bringing together scholars of ancient world, scholars of early modern, scholars of the United States, and putting it all together. At that time, I remember I got into a very big fight with my good friend, Annette Gordon-Reed, because I was going to write a piece, and I was going to use the term predator to refer to Thomas Jefferson. Well, as Laura knows from being a longtime fellow at Monticello, calling Thomas Jefferson a predator was going to not go over very well. So instead I changed it to hypocrisies, the hypocrisies of the slave-owning class during that period, because I thought it was something very important to explore and exciting. Ironically for me at that time, I was also just in a new position teaching in Ireland. And I was over at Queen's University, and when I came over and gave my kind of inaugural lecture on, it was my actual inaugural lecture, I learned my lesson, but when I gave my first lecture talking about sexual hypocrisies, I found the Irish weren't very interested in that, and I got so much pushback. So indeed, I can say at the 1990s and in the early aughts, we had a situation where feminist scholars were trying to turn around the way we looked at institutions generally, at educational institutions, at religious institutions. Certainly in Ireland at the time, there were other fights going on about the church, and we have to look and see how that has changed. Roe v. Wade being very much on my mind, as I just did a project on it, and I had an Irish scholar speaking and telling us about the fact that in the 1980s you added a constitutional amendment prohibiting abortion, and then you have less than 50 years later a dramatic change in Ireland. So we look at personhood as something that was fought out in the 19th century. We're going to wipe out slavery and establish personhood. Oh wait, but women still can't quite be citizens. And so indeed, the linking of race and sex in 19th century American history into the 20th century is so very central. And those of us looking at slavery find that we get in a great tangle, but luckily we can now call it intersectional studies, which is something that has become quite popular and contentious in the United States. Just to give you an idea about how contentious it is, in the state in which I teach, which is an extremely conservative government, the leaders of educational leaders, board leaders, are trying to pass a piece of legislation which would prohibit use of the term slavery in schools. Now, universities are not yet touched by this, but in schools. And instead they want the language replaced with involuntary relocation. So this is something that is actually being proposed, actually being discussed. Now, at the university level, it has been mandated that use of the term critical race theory, critical race studies, is prohibited. And if people teach it, they can be stripped of their tenure and they can be fired. So we are looking at a great crisis. And it does revolve around people teaching the subject of slavery, the aspects of slavery, and slavery's legacy. So it's still, as I said, very, very much with us. Even teaching that the production of slaves is what allowed a state like Texas to boom, to declare its independence, to come back into the Union, to be part of the Confederacy, to be a dynamic process, because you had not just the production of cotton, but the production of people. Because from the peopling of the United States, and we've learned about the peopling of the United States, and we've learned that some textbooks have tried to talk about Africans as migrants rather than as enslaved persons. We look and we see that the significance of the transatlantic journey is emphasized, but even more so from the 1990s onward through the great work of Ira Berlin and his team of scholars working on the Freedmen Bureau papers, the Freedom Project, the 5 volumes that tell us what slavery was like through the story of enslaved people themselves in the wake of emancipation. So these documents can give us an idea about what slavery was like. And we learned that an even greater revolution was the movement of people of color from the coast inward. And that great movement was well over 1 million between the Revolution and the Civil War. And we know that was truly what brought slavery into American empire building during that period. And women's role was so significant. But equally, some of these feminist scholars looked at things like the data, the records, and they found that when you looked at slave prices, for example, in New Orleans and in other markets, you would find this unusual situation of young females being a higher price than a field hand. And not all females, but indeed there were common terms during that period for breeding, a breeder woman versus a woman that was clearly not being put on the auction block for the purpose of breeding, but rather for sexual exploitation. So the introduction of the notion that slavery was also a system of exploiting sexuality, of dealing with issues of sexuality as well as race, was something that scholars were introducing during the period from 1990 to the present. And I think has really created a great revolution. When I was over here talking about dismantling the mammy, it was a lot of historiography. But I'm very pleased to say that COVID, for all of its ills, and it was a very dark period for us. Most of us had to go online, and most of us had to learn how dispiriting it could be to deal with these issues. I teach at a very dynamic university, the University of Texas in San Antonio, where over 50% of our students are known as first gen. Do we have that term here in Britain, and so as a result, 50% of our students have no member of their family that has ever been in college, and we reach out, and the 8 years that I've been there, programs have been put forward so that low-income families can send their children to our university at no tuition cost. That has been instituted. Simultaneously, over 50% of our students are Latino. So the Latinx community is really dynamic and growing. And for those of us in slavery studies, the study of these particular issues and the intersections of race are very exciting. As I said, I started out in African American studies at Harvard in the 1970s, and I feel that in the 20s, in the new century, looking at these questions of the intersections of race and class and gender in the Latino studies world is equally exciting. So we are trying to transform, and I think by transforming, we have to include the gender issue. For most of us, we know, and I remember when I was sitting there in graduate school at seminars and learning how many jobs were going to go to women and how transformative society was going to be. At the same time, we look at movements over the past decade or so, and we see the pendulum swinging quite harshly in our face on many different issues, many different reversals. But I can say in the academy, I'm very proud to say that the funding of enslavement studies has been dramatic. The other thing that I'm very proud of is there's been a kind of separation. As a Civil War historian, I can say it's not your grandmother's Civil War. It's really changing that from the 1990s forward, gender has been a dynamic issue. But equally important to look at the centenary of the Civil War, where you had great dramatic protests over the fact that some of the commissioners were meeting in racially segregated cities, which caused a great uproar and created splits within the movement to commemorate the Civil War. And we look at the sesquicentennial of the American Civil War 50 years later, and I can say being in the city of Charleston, where they look at the original Fort Sumter battle, and I know Laura's been to Charleston many times, you could say the transformation of attitudes in that community is quite remarkable. So indeed, we have a new field called emancipation studies. And therefore, to say that yes, there's slavery studies, but there's also emancipation, and emancipation as an international aspect, and looking at the way different societies deal with the transition from slavery to freedom. Because, and often when people say, why would you go over to England to study America? Because I did my MA in a British university, the University of Sussex. And I said, a fish doesn't think much about water until you get out of it. So I do say to all of you, going to another place and studying your subject there can really help you reevaluate it. Although I will say that when I did come over to assume a chair at a UK university, I did have a bit of a time warp where I thought, wait, what year is this? Why am I being spoken to this way? This is really quite ridiculous. Don't they know about gender? Don't they know about women taking their place? No, I think it was a really interesting setback for me. And I can also say that coming back, as I do frequently, I left here in the teens, that coming back frequently, I find the way in which racial dynamics in the UK are being addressed more at the academy and university level, not just because it's very easy to do it through slavery, but through emancipation. That's another matter entirely. So I see that very dramatic transition going on at various universities, particularly Birmingham has a lecture series, others. I'm sure you have a very dynamic way here, and I've seen some of your lectures and seminars. And this center, I think, can be a great boon for spreading the word more widely, that the UK is ready to address historic past and to incorporate these attitudes and these issues into contemporary politics, as they are anyway, but it's now time for us in the academy to articulate them. I did want to say that the issue of women's roles in slavery, I began by addressing what I thought was neglected, which is the role of slave holding women, whether they were wives of slave owners or whether they were women married to slave holders, was something that was not really written about much in the literature in the 1960s. So when I wrote The Plantation Mistress, I became acquainted simultaneously with the field, and Deborah Gray White was writing her book, Aren't I a Woman? And we sort of came out roughly about the same time. And we can look at the way in which material is spread. I'll be quite honest, there's still people looking very directly at the role of white women in slavery, but that has changed dramatically over the past half century, particularly recently with the work of Stephanie Jones Rogers. They were her property, looking at the way in which white women could and were complicit in slaveholding. And we can look at the work of Elizabeth Fox Genovese, who had much to say about what she felt was the role of women in taking on a masterly role in their everyday running of plantations. We also, I think, though, have to look to the way in which Dinah Ramey Berry, who now, by the way, is a dean. She left the University of Texas, where she and Leslie Harris put on a really magnificent conference at their university. They thought they'd look at women and slaveholding. And over 300 people came. And then they had workshops, and then a book was produced by the two of them, containing some of the very exciting new work going on in the field, honoring, of course, Stephanie Camp, the late Stephanie Camp, whose work we have to treasure and remember, but who died young. We also look at the fact that younger people going into MA programs like yours are very excited about the ability, and I'm excited about the ability. When I came over to Queen's University in 2006, it seemed absurd that I would be able to have people do primary work on slavery. But now the digitization project, so digital humanities, digital history, public history, is booming to the degree that we both have more funding for it, but we also have more ability to do sophisticated work remotely. I don't know whether that is good or bad, because some of us really do treasure walking in the spaces where our characters, our persons, the people that we've been living with on our dissertations have walked, and I can greatly recommend that. Although I remember the poor Virginia archivist who had to beg me to leave the table if I was going to cry. I was going to mess up the papers, but reading some of the accounts I found so moving that I was unable to hold back. And I do think that most recently the work of Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, a name I hope all of you know, but if you don't, you will look up, who recently passed. And you can go onto YouTube and see an interview with her, which was done in October by my colleague. Jorge Felipe Gonzalez and I visited her. We were teaching a course called Digital Slavery and Slavery and its Legacy in the Digital Age, and we interviewed her. And she confided to us what it meant to be an early databaser, what it meant to do the kind of early work of counting on slaves and telling the truth about the numbers and the impact of slavery. And her database is carved into granite at Whitney Plantation outside of New Orleans. So if you go along a road, it's called River Road, and there's a long history there of the preservation. And we all know about preservation history, which is also undergoing quite a revolution. And I look at most of the boards that I'm on, and I'm sitting there with women who are introducing a lot of new techniques. Men can introduce these new techniques as well, but why they've sat on these boards and not thought about introducing the notions of the majority of people on a plantation. What was their work? What did they do? Where did they live? How did they live? Historic homes are undergoing these kinds of transformations in the UK. Following the 2008 commemoration of the ending of the slave trade, I know here in Great Britain there was a kind of uprising in the museum community, and many people in slave studies found themselves being employed, being consulted to try and tell fuller stories of what was the role of money and what was the role of slaveholding in building all of these universities. I'm sure Liverpool if it hasn't done it, will soon embark upon that. I tried to get Queen's University to do it. They said no. And now that Harvard's done it, they're willing to follow. But it is something that really can be enriching. It can be employing history MAs. It can be something that tells you stories. But you do find always in all of these exploratory studies, as I did, women about whom nothing is known, and yet they become important. We think there's a recent film on Nat Turner under quite a bit of Birth of a Nation, under quite a bit of controversy, but there have been other films. Charles Burnett did a wonderful documentary about Nat Turner. So we have a look at this, but where is Cherry Turner? What was her role? What was the wife's role? How can we look and evaluate the way in which women contributed to resistance, women contributed to rebellion? Certainly, limitation of reproduction is an issue that Dinah Barry wrote about 20 years ago, and people are now continuing to explore. But I can carry on, as you can see, talking about nothing and everything. And I do want to leave you with one wonderful book that I just reviewed that is coming out, which I think brings together a lot of the marvelous theoretical work being done with a practical work of not the theoretical. Well, I have to be honest, I've never thought theoretical work was practical. In that I feel now we're in a great crisis in the United States in terms of history, and we have to tell people how important it is to study history. And that if you do study history, not only will it profit you individually, but as a career, it might be a wonderful thing that you learn techniques of research and evidence and putting that evidence to good supply. Again, in my graduate program, I've had to change quite a bit because up until 6 years ago, I was able to tell my students, when you go online and you're looking for documentation, you look for .gov, because then you know it can be a trusted site. That wasn't true after 2017, and we had to really change our orientation in some ways. But it is true that learning to peruse the internet, learning to verify, learning to look at evidence can be very, very important. So a new book that I can greatly recommend that is coming out in 2023 is by Nikki Taylor, and it's called Brooding Over Bloody Revenge. It will be out in 2023, and it talks about the role of violence among enslaved women, how it's employed, and she's using theoretical Black feminist theory and a practical application to known and infamous cases of women's fighting violence as well as being violent during slavery. So it does overcome a lot of the literature that tries to say that women are soft, men are hard. Look at how we use, do you want a soft copy of my paper? Do you want a hard copy of my paper? It's so hard. I have to say paper copy now. And I feel that we have to really think about the language we're using constantly. In museum studies, for example, museums are now trying to renovate and tell a true story. I beg them not to use that word. And I also beg them not to use the word complete. I'm going to tell the complete story of the Alamo. Oh my goodness, we'll be there till the 22nd century fighting over that one. So in other words, you have to really think in your field about doing layered work, where you bring in multiple perspectives in order to show the clashing interpretations of the period as well as the present. And I hope all of you can go out there and find a wonderful subject to sink your teeth in. And of course, if you're looking for a sunnier climate, a warmer climate, I can greatly recommend that our 2-year master's program. And people often come to us with their master's completed at other places, but because we have a 2-year program, which is funded competitively, and we are very pleased to announce that in 2023, we will also have funding for summer internships at local historical organizations. So you can get $15,000 for your first year of study, $18,000 for your second year of study, and $7,500 for 10 weeks of summer work. So we do believe that we have the most robust funding for a master's in the United States. It's in history, So people can choose any topic they want, but we recommend that you think about our specialists, which work on American history, on Latin American history, and those are the two areas, especially borderlands, that we specialize in. So with that advertisement, I'd like to thank you and open it up to any questions.